An escalating crisis in Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, is gaining ground as it advances toward Baghdad. And the Iraqi government is now losing control of some border crossings near Syria and Jordan. This after rebel fighters took over 3 more towns overnight in Iraq's Anbar province. The Iraqi army has responded with airstrikes over Mosul, where ISIL fighters took over control about 2 weeks ago, forcing hundreds of thousands of residents to flee. As ISIL makes its way to Iraq's capital, residents there prepare for more violence. Jane Araf is in Baghdad, and Jane, Baghdad residents obviously familiar with violence for several years now. What are you seeing in terms of their preparations for what seems to be the inevitable invasion of ISIL?
Well, certainly there are a lot more security forces around. There are a lot of Iraqis trying to leave. Now that extraordinary development of the Jordanian border falling to ISIL fighters as well as the Syrian border certainly makes it more difficult for a lot of people who otherwise would have gone by road. Now, as you mentioned, these are very dramatic developments, but here in Baghdad, residents have been struggling with danger for years.
Mohammed Salah was out with his mother when a car bomb exploded outside their building. He's 8 years old, and for as long as he can remember, he's been afraid. The explosion 2 weeks ago killed more than 20 people. Some were his friends.
Maya and Haider and Ahmed, I knew them well. Maya and Jassim and Haider, Jassim, were brothers, and Ahmed was the nephew.
Jassim and Haider and Ahmed weren't officials or policemen. They sold vegetables. But just living in Baghdad made them a target. In this middle-class neighborhood of Karada, a family's hopes and dreams reduced to rubble.
This is an ordinary street, but it's quite close to one of the entrances of the Green Zone, the home of the Iraqi government and the U.S. Embassy. 6 people were killed in this building alone when the explosion hit. People here now are rebuilding their shops because that's what Iraqis do. But the question is, can Iraqis rebuild faster than their country is being destroyed?
As many as 5 million Iraqis have left their country since 2003, and they're still leaving. Those who remain try to survive the car bombs and clean up the damage. Abdul Wahab Abdul Razak has owned this electrical shop for almost 40 years. He was at evening prayers at the mosque when a man parked a car packed with explosives on the corner, walked away, and detonated it.
I heard the explosion, but people didn't let me go back. They said another one might happen. Vehicles were burning when I went back to the area. People were panicked. There were some dead and a lot injured.
Abdul Razak lost tens of thousands of dollars in the blast. Almost no one has insurance in Iraq. He's reopening his shop as soon as he can. With the onslaught of fighters moving through Iraq, some fear Baghdad could fall. But here, on this street corner, it's already fallen.
And Michael, a lot of residents of Baghdad aren't entirely sure that there actually will be fighters on their doorstep. But at the very least, what they're watching is something perhaps even more tragic, the disintegration of the country that they love.
Well, Jane, obviously a lot of international pressure on the Iraqi government right now. How was the government there responding to the latest moves by ISIL?
Well, it's definitely scrambling because what we've seen is this extraordinary onslaught of a very organized military force against perhaps an equally extraordinary retreat by Iraqi security forces trained over the past decade, much of it by the United States and other Western powers. When the border to the Jordanian border of Trabeel fell, apparently, we're told by security sources, that soldiers and border police basically just melted away when they were told that ISIL was at their doorstep. So what we're seeing really is a retreat by Iraqi security forces, and Iraqi government struggling to deal with that, as well as calling on help from the U.S. government.
Jane Araf reporting live from Baghdad. Thank you. Meanwhile, the leader of neighboring Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is speaking out against the United States. He says, quote, "We strongly oppose the intervention of the United States and others in the domestic affairs of Iraq," end quote. The Ayatollah went on to say that the Iraqi government and its people would be able to end the crisis themselves. The Iranian government did say it would consider lending military aid for the Shia-led government in Baghdad. Secretary of State John Kerry has arrived in Jordan after an announced visit earlier to Egypt. Earlier today, Kerry met with Egypt's new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. For more on Kerry's Middle East stops, we bring in John Terrett, who's live in Washington, D.C. John, what did we learn about Kerry's stopover in Jordan?
Well, Michael, good afternoon. We know that he's there in Amman at the moment and has been meeting with the Jordanian foreign minister. That meeting is now beginning to wrap up. There's nothing more planned on his schedule for today. But earlier he was, as you say, in Cairo meeting with the new president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He's only been in power for about 10 days. He also met with the foreign minister in Egypt and the head of the Arab League as well. And the message from Secretary Kerry was that the U.S. recognizes that Egypt has been through a difficult transition since the Arab Spring, and that there is a desire in Washington for that transition to be successful because both countries share strategic interests. But it's not all sweetness and light. Secretary Kerry pointing out that the U.S. is seeking reforms in areas of the judiciary, political and also human rights. He talked about the imprisonment of NGOs and journalists, including the 3 Al Jazeera journalists still being held, and said that he would leave President al-Sisi to talk about that in the days and weeks ahead. On Iraq, Secretary Kerry saying that the U.S. is not to blame for what's happening involving ISIL there at the moment, and that Washington is looking for the Iraqi people to choose their leaders that will represent all of them, not just one sect. On the issue of ISIL, Secretary Kerry, who calls them ISIS, said that it's important to clear them out, to stop them creating a terrorism base in Iraq. Here's what he said.
ISIL is a threat to all of the countries in the region. Even today in our conversation with President al-Sisi and with the foreign minister, both expressed deep concerns about the impact of a group like ISIL and what it means to the region. No country is safe from that kind of spread of terror.
And Michael, Secretary Kerry in the Jordanian capital Amman right now. He's heading on to Europe. We know that much. Later in the week, he'll be calling in Brussels and Paris. He'll be talking to allies, and his job there will be to discuss international and local politics as they pertain to Iraq right now. Michael?
Well, John, obviously Secretary Kerry visiting with allies in the region. One of those allies is also Israel, and we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu today for the first time on the crisis in Iraq. Some pretty strong words from the Israeli Prime Minister.
He had a two-tone message. He was speaking on the line to NBC earlier this morning on one of the Sunday broadcasts, and his point was that do what you deem necessary in Iraq to sort out the problem involving ISIL, but do not let Iran get the bomb. He said do not let Iran dominate Iraq in the way that they've been allowed to dominate Syria and also Lebanon in recent years. Here's exactly what he had to say on NBC's Meet the Press.
What you're seeing in the Middle East today, in Iraq and in Syria, is the historic hatreds between radical Shiites, in this case led by Iran, and radical Sunnis led by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others. Now, both of these camps are enemies of the United States. And when your enemies are fighting each other, don't strengthen either one of them. Weaken both. And I think by far the worst outcome that could come out of this is that one of these factions, Iran, would come out with nuclear weapons capability. That would be a tragic mistake. It will make everything else pale in comparison.
The Israeli Prime Minister. Now, finally, Michael, back to Egypt, and the State Department has released $570 million of the $1.3 billion it gives to Egypt every year for military spending. The Congress has been seeking to withhold that money. Indeed, $70 million has been withheld, but the money's gone over as a goodwill gesture at the start of the El-Sisi administration in Cairo. But the U.S. is looking, as I said earlier, for judicial, political and human rights reforms, and unless it sees it, the rest of the $500 million is going to stay in the bank here in D.C. Mike?
John Terrett, live from Washington. Thank you, John. We're joined now by Juan Cole, Al Jazeera's international affairs contributor. He joins us from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Juan, thanks for the time today.
Thank you.
The Sunni rebels have taken a post on the border with Syria. Now, our Jane Araf in Baghdad is hearing that they may have taken over a border town with Jordan as well. How significant is it that these two areas are now controlled by ISIL?
It's an extremely alarming development. This is a very vicious group that thinks nothing of killing innocents, and it has now wiped out the international borders between themselves and Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. I think all three are in danger.
It seems to be, from all the eyes on the outside looking in, Juan, that it's inevitable, at least people feel that way, that ISIL will make its way to Baghdad. But Jana Roth just said the citizens there in the capital city don't feel as if that will happen. From your standpoint, is it inevitable that ISIL will reach Baghdad?
Well, I think they'll make an attempt, especially to establish some footholds in western Baghdad, which is largely Sunni Arab in coloration. But Baghdad is a largely Shiite city now. It's a city of some 7 million people, and it must be 80–85% Shiite. It does have its own neighborhood militias who are very well armed, and so I don't expect ISIL to be able to take the capital. I think it's been able to make these advances because it has formed coalitions with disgruntled Sunni Arabs in majority Sunni cities. But I don't think it can come down into the Shiite areas very easily.
And that's due to sheer number and the lack of military resources compared to the Iraqi government?
Well, also the lack of popular support. In a place like Mosul, people were so done out with the government of Nouri al-Maliki, a Shiite government, that they were willing to throw it off in a kind of popular rebellion in conjunction with ISIL. But no such sentiment exists in Baghdad.
What link, Juan, do you see, if any, in terms of what's going on in Iraq currently, is linked to the civil war in Syria? There's been a lot of criticism, if you will, from a lot of international voices to say that people should have been involved in Syria from a much earlier standpoint. Is that a direct correlation to what's going on now in Iraq?
Well, the Syrian civil war certainly is part of this story. The ISIL was among the more effective fighters once the Syrian revolution turned to civil war. It started taking Syrian army bases and looting them for munitions and equipment. It gained battlefield experience and tactical experience, which it's now deploying back in Iraq. But you know, the American stance and that of most of its allies in the region was actually such that made them allies of ISIL de facto. They didn't give it monetary or other support, but ISIL is fighting against the Bashar al-Assad government, which is allied with Iran. And the U.S. was trying to undermine the Bashar al-Assad government and undermine Iran's reach in the region. So I think there's a real contradiction here that the U.S. is supporting the Shiites in Baghdad and supporting the Sunnis in Iraq and in Syria, I mean to say. And I think they have to choose a team.
Very interesting perspective, to say the least. Juan Cole, Al Jazeera International Affairs contributor, joining us live from Ann Arbor, Michigan.